The purpose of this video is to issue a challenge, particularly to people who are believers in electric guitar Tonewood. Now, this challenge doesn't conclusively prove the electric guitar Tonewood issue one way or the other, but it does provide a degree of evidence that the people who do believe in electric guitar Tonewood essentially support their beliefs with bullshit. Now, let's examine a typical progression of an electric guitar Tonewood discussion. One of the things, as somebody who has discussed and debated this issue for a very long time on the internet, that I've noticed is that electric guitar Tonewood believers tend to use a narrow range of fallacies to justify their belief. They never provide evidence. However, some people have attempted to provide evidence, but what it amounts to is pseudoscience. So two good examples of that would be the Strandberg tests and the Rob Chapman video. In the Strandberg tests, they show some spectrographic variety in two different wood species. They claim, aha, that proves Tonewood. It absolutely doesn't, for 101 different reasons that we can get into at another time. The other one, the Rob Chapman video, they take two different guitars, and if you listen really hard, maybe one kind of sounds a little bit different than the other. And the implication is, since they're made of two different wood species, that proves Tonewood. Again, that's ridiculous. You can take one guitar and make it sound completely different just by strumming harder or softer, closer or further away from the bridge. So if you're going to prove something, you have to eliminate all the variables, or at least eliminate most of the variables that could contribute to what you're trying to prove or disprove, and these tests are basically ridiculous. They're classic examples of pseudoscience. One of the things that Tonewood believers tend to exhibit is that they register on a spectrum, or let's call it a continuum, the continuum of Tonewood belief. At the furthest end of the Tonewood believer continuum are, let's call them soft believers. These are people who believe, maybe Tonewood makes some kind of a difference, but I'm not exactly sure what it is, and it's really hard to prove. Now, these people, their beliefs are basically insulated from debunking, given the amount of effort and expense it would take to run them down. You'd have to do really elaborate testing, and it would just require a lot of stuff. However, once you move further up the continuum, let's say we get to the middle of the continuum, and these are the mediocre believers. These are people who might say, I don't think Tonewood maybe is really that big of a deal, but it definitely contributes to your tone. Now you're getting into something that, were those beliefs to be valid, they should be able to evidence them by providing some kind of proof. Once we go to the opposite end and we go to the hard believers, these are the people who say anybody that has good ears knows that maple makes a snappier sound, or whatever their narrative is. These are the beliefs that, were they to be true, they would have no problem proving. But they never seem to be able to do it. So the challenge here, and this is a two-part challenge, this is the first part of it, is for the people who believe that Tonewood is something that can obviously be heard, to very simply provide video evidence of it. And that you should have no problem doing that. Go find somebody playing a guitar with a rosewood fretboard and say, here, if you don't have good ears, that's it's your problem. You just don't have good ears. You can't hear it, but I can. Show some videos. One of the interesting things is that when you run down an electric Tonewood believer, one of the first things they try to do once they realize that they can't really prove themselves is they try to shift their own position on the believer continuum. They'll go from a hard believer, and then when you challenge them, well, then they try to say, really, maybe I'm a little bit softer. Maybe it's harder to prove. So we're not going after the soft believers. It takes too much effort to run them down. Even the mediocre believers, they have a little bit too much in their catalog of excuses of why they can't prove it. They say things like YouTube audio compression, which, again, is bullshit. If your beliefs were valid, that wouldn't influence it. But what I'd like to do is round up a few of the people who say, you must not have good ears if you can't hear it. My contention to you is, if your beliefs are true, you should be able to prove it. And on this medium, with an enormous library of instruments made of different woods, you should be able to go to a few of them and say, here's an example of where you can hear rosewood. Here's an example of where you can hear maple. Once you do that, we can move to step 2.